So Classic WoW came out last Monday, and I don't know about you, but personally, I'm having a ton of fun with it. All jokes aside, as of writing this, I have just over 2 days /played in the week or so it's been out. Classic WoW has been taking the gaming industry by storm, despite Blizzard's initial skepticism around its potential popularity.
You think you do, but you don't.
Naturally, this begs the question, why? Why is Classic WoW remembered so fondly after over 15 years? Some people seem to think it's mostly about rose-tinted glasses and nostalgia, which I can agree is part of it for some people. However, I wanted to dig a bit deeper and try to articulate why I think Classic WoW remains so resonant for so many gamers, especially in the context of the modern video game industry. After mulling it over for a bit, the answer actually seems to be relatively simple. Classic WoW is the Dark Souls of MMOs. Okay, so now that meme's out of the way, let's dig into what I'm actually trying to say. If you're not familiar with WoW, then you might be surprised to learn that there have been one or two patches over the 15 years since its launch, which have invariably changed the game a bit over the years. And if you ask the community, you'll likely find them saying that over time, WoW has become slowly more and more focused on accessibility, which many fans of Classic WoW would argue is to the game's detriment. Accessibility can mean many different things to many different people, so let me clarify a bit. Accessibility in terms of video games, broadly speaking, means to cater to a wider audience. In game design, there are an incredible amount of ways to account for this. At a surface level, though, there are two major ways in which one can frame designing for accessibility. The first way is to include accessibility features that don't impact the core gameplay experience for the vast majority of players. These are almost always considered objectively good features to add, and usually include things like colorblind options or subtitles. For most players, there's no reason to pay these features any mind, but for those who couldn't enjoy the game otherwise due to out-of-game impairments like colorblindness or hearing loss, these features significantly improve their core game experience and allow them to enjoy a game they otherwise wouldn't have been able to. If you're interested in learning more about this type of accessibility design, I'd highly recommend checking out GMTK's series on designing for disability. The other major way of accounting for accessibility in game design is the much more controversial one, and the line isn't exactly clear on where it begins and where it ends. Simply put, design that changes or adds options to the core mechanics that allow for more player agency or convenience is the other major way to make a game more accessible. Using a straightforward example, cheat codes, back in the day, would often allow a player to become invincible, have infinite cash in game, or spawn in overpowered weapons. All of those things allow the player to not have to worry about health, damage, death, or earning currency, thus making the game more accessible to players who are looking for less of a challenge in combat or just don't have the time to grind for currency. However, as should be obvious, by using those cheat codes, the player essentially breaks the core game experience that the developers intended for. If a boss is designed to do X damage and the player is designed to be able to take Y damage before dying, then that trade-off is what creates the core gameplay experience in terms of challenge and progression. By adjusting those metrics, a player who previously found the game too difficult may now be able to clear it with ease, thus making the game more accessible. However, if a player who may have otherwise enjoyed the challenge sees the option to become invincible, they may very well be tempted to take the easy route, potentially robbing them of a satisfying experience that the developers intended for. Now, this can get fairly complex relatively quickly, because there are arguments to be made in that by adding in options and delineating to the player what the intended series of options are for a game, you may be able to strike a healthy balance of additional accessibility without compromising the core gameplay experience. However, the caveat that I want to throw out there is that player psychology has to be taken into account, especially if the game is multiplayer or competitive in some way. Just by adding in additional options, even if the developer explicitly states what the intended set of options are, it can change how the player interacts with the game fundamentally. Bringing it back to MMOs, in a world where there is a harder but more intrinsically satisfying method of doing things, and a separate option that gets you to the endpoint more quickly and with less pain, players may be much more tempted to take the path of least resistance, even if it means they find the end result much less satisfying. Bringing the conversation back to WoW again, many of the features that players point to in regards to WoW's focus on accessibility over the years are the second type of accessibility that I mentioned, ones that directly impact the core gameplay experience. There are a lot of examples used of game features that have been changed, added, or removed, so let's take a step back and try to examine the larger picture for a moment. When you look at what people say made Classic WoW so great, generally speaking, there's one major point that is often touched on or brought up directly. That feature is Classic WoW's sense of world. Creating a sense of world in a video game is no easy task, and is comprised of a multitude of smaller game design elements that have to work together in unison. For Classic WoW, these elements are a sense of scale, a sense of community, and slower pacing. Alright, let's start with one of the easier ones. Sense of scale. In order to build a compelling world, you need a compelling world. If you build an extremely detailed alleyway that breathes life and energy, that's awesome, but it will likely fail to convey a sense of place in the larger world, as its ability to convey information about the world is inherently limited due to its scale. Classic WoW, on the other hand, goes to the other extreme. Their environments aren't the most detailed, especially if you turn on the original graphics settings. But they go big, and I mean really big in terms of scale. For players who walked across all of Kalimdor, it took them 7 hours and 45 minutes to get from one side of the continent to the other. And that's only half the map. Granted, they were walking, not running, but still, that's a big world. Now, anyone can make a massive empty world, just as some developers could focus on a hyper-detailed alleyway. The key is to find a good balance of detail plus scale in order to make the world feel diverse and interesting, while also feeling like it's not a small play space created just for the players to play in. Now, having a large, semi-detailed map is all well and good, but a sense of scale isn't just about the world the developers built. That's just a solid starting point. The key to really selling players on a sense of scale is about how the players are able to navigate through it. In modern WoW, mounts are much more common and easy to acquire, which significantly increases the player's ability to travel from place to place. On top of this, most zones also now support flying mounts, meaning players don't need to navigate through the forests or around mountains. They can just fly over everything at their whim. In Classic WoW, players aren't allowed to purchase a mount until level 40, which is 2/3 of the way through their leveling experience. On top of this, mounts are really expensive, meaning even once you hit level 40, it's pretty unlikely you'll be able to purchase a mount until much later on. I definitely know that's going to be the case for me anyways. Oh god. There's another mount speed upgrade at level 60, epic mounts, but as you can imagine, that skill is also appropriately expensive and hard to earn. Collectively, this makes the world feel much larger, regardless of its actual size. It also helps make the player character feel much more insignificant and smaller in the world, really selling the idea that you're just a human, dwarf, or orc actually existing in the world, rather than a player playing a video game who has the world built just for them. In modern WoW, your first mount is acquired at level 20 for a much smaller cost, followed by epic mounts being acquired at level 40, and flying mounts being acquired at level 60. There are even more mount speed upgrades later on, all of which make the player feel much more empowered and offer convenience for navigating around the world, but at the cost of the world's sense of scale. After all, distance is only relative as to how quickly you can navigate it. The philosophy of the player character feeling insignificant or small in the world is a key component of Classic WoW that is encapsulated in many game design elements, not just movement. Acquiring gold was a much more arduous task back in the day. Just getting one gold required time and effort, and slowly building up the copper and silver currencies to finally tick over to that 1 gold mark was an extremely rewarding sensation. By comparison, in modern WoW, some rare mounts can be bought for as much as 5 million gold. Objectively speaking, gold numbers can be scaled up infinitely, as they are just a function of income generated via time investment subtracted by the price of goods, all of which can be scaled up and down without changing the actual time investment needed. In Classic WoW, though, the gold numbers are scaled down, while the time investment to acquire goods is scaled up. The smaller numbers help make the world feel more self-contained and manageable, even if it's mostly a psychological illusion. The larger time investment to acquire goods in general helps create a better sense of pride and accomplishment. As much of a meme as that is nowadays, having goals that require more grinding actually fits really well within the scope of an MMO trying to create a sense of world. Although making things easier to get makes the games more accessible as it reduces the amount of time needed to make meaningful progress, it in turn makes the rewards feel less satisfying to acquire as a result. The grinding required helps build a sense of place in the world, as more time has to be spent engaging with the game mechanics within the world, and goes along with the theme of making the player feel like they're starting from nothing, as an everyday person living in the world trying to slowly build their way up. This in turn further sells the sense of the player's place in the world. Another main game design element that Classic WoW does exceptionally well is creating a sense of community within the context of the world. For people unfamiliar with Classic WoW, it runs on a series of servers. Each player has to choose a server to create a character on, and that character exists within only that server. This naturally creates a series of communities on each server, as it's not uncommon to see familiar faces, even outside of your immediate friend or guild group. You know that when you see someone on a server, they exist in your world, and there's a consistency that's created as a result. In many modern games, there's almost always a focus on creating opportunities for immediate friend groups to connect with each other, but those often leverage relationships outside of the game rather than focusing on building new ones. Classic WoW helps build a sense of community, even if the players choose to play mostly on their own. Examples of how this can be displayed through gameplay is that if you were to group with a random set of 5 players to complete a dungeon, and at the end of the dungeon stole a very powerful item, those other players could then tell their guildmates or announce in public channels that you are a player not to be trusted, and that other people should not group with you. In other words, there can be social repercussions for your in-game actions in a way that's just not possible in most modern games. Taking a moment to look at how most modern games operate nowadays, it's common practice to place a high priority on getting players into their games quickly. This often leads to a queue button, where players can agree to be put into a group with random strangers that are a part of the overall population of players in their region. This often means that most people you play with, you'll never see again, meaning there's no social repercussions for your actions outside of the context of your immediate grouping. As I'm sure you can guess by now, modern WoW moved in favor of the contemporary model of matchmaking, in the forms of tools called Looking for Group and Raid Finder. These tools allow individuals to queue for a piece of group content, drawing from a much larger pool of players, making the turnaround time to engage with the content much shorter and thus much more accessible. But this comes at the cost of the sense of community. On top of adding these tools into the game, modern WoW also changed how the server architecture itself worked. Given that group quests exist outside of preset dungeons and raids, having a small pool of players existing in any given zone in the world can create bottlenecks where players can't engage with certain group content due to the small number of available players in a given zone. To solve this problem, Blizzard implemented a system called Cross Realms, in which players from other servers could be phased in and out of your zone in order to make sure there were a minimum amount of players available to do group content with. While this did help solve the problem of not enough players available to do in-world group questing, it did so at the cost of removing the sense of server communities. No longer were you assured that someone you ran into would be someone you were likely to see again. Players just became nameless entities that were a means to an end, instead of an opportunity to build a connection with or have potential social implications down the road. By focusing more on building out a consistent social ecosystem on servers, Classic WoW is able to further sell players on the sense of world, given that the players themselves act as an agent to reinforce the consistency of the play space. Alright, lastly, but by no means least, Classic WoW's slower pacing is also able to help reinforce the sense of world it creates. This specifically is where the reference to Dark Souls comes into play. Classic WoW is not a challenging game, but it is a punishing one. Mechanical skill can only get you so far in terms of progression within the world. Leveling up and running dungeons is a matter of leashing enemies correctly, meaning to only engage in combat with a few select enemies at a time in order to not be overwhelmed. Doing this correctly requires patience, thoughtfulness, and situational awareness. Sound familiar? It should, since that's basically the core skills and combat model that Dark Souls is renowned for. Now, this type of combat pretty much goes against most modern game design views. Games these days usually focus on how to keep the player engaged moment to moment with as much flashiness as possible and a high emphasis on action or challenges that require frequent and repeated inputs from players. Classic WoW, on the other hand, forces the players to take their time and smell the roses, so to speak. Just like in Dark Souls, if players are forced to spend more time paying attention to their surroundings, they will naturally become more engaged with the world as a necessity of the gameplay. By punishing players with long corpse runs, aka respawn timers, if they play too recklessly, the game creates a natural reward cycle for players who take their time and, in turn, engage with the world as a 3D space to navigate, which just further reinforces the sense of world. If you've ever heard of anyone talk about Dark Souls, they'll likely mention the world and level design as one of the most memorable aspects, and there's a reason for it. Going back to accessibility for a moment, the combination of a low mechanical skill floor, combined with rewarding the player for situational awareness, is actually a really accessible model of game design. It's much easier for the average person to be able to absorb visual information at their own pace, instead of developing quick reaction times that require highly mechanically demanding inputs. On top of this, most progression and punishments built into Classic WoW utilize time as the major factor. This means that if you die, all it costs you is time. On the other hand, if you put enough time into the game, you'll be guaranteed to make meaningful progress, which isn't always true of other games. Similarly to situational awareness, time is a much more universally available attribute than skill. That being said, given that time investment is quite high for endgame progression, there is enough of a visible spectrum of progression that highly engaged players still feel rewarded for engaging deeply with the game. The problem with time investment as a major progression factor of the game is that time is a highly competitive resource when looked at outside of the scope of games. More so today now than ever. With so many different forms of media and entertainment, such as video games, movies, TV shows, etc., it's hard to convince someone who doesn't know anything about your game to engage with a world that requires so much time investment, which is also just known as having a really high barrier for entry. This is why most modern companies focus on the immediacy of engagement and short-term rewards, which are more often associated with accessibility, as immediate and frequent engagement make the entertainment product easier to jump straight into. If everything is competing for your time, it's easy to see the importance of trying to hook someone into playing your game and keeping them as engaged as possible from moment to moment. The downside to that is that while entertaining in the short term, it's often difficult for these forms of entertainment to keep players engaged over time. While playing a game that has a ridiculously rewarding moment-to-moment gameplay loop feels great at the time, why is it worth it for them to keep coming back? The most common answers to this seems to either be ongoing story elements or long-term progression loops, and Classic WoW focuses on the latter. If we're using modern conventional wisdom, then the quote-unquote problem with Classic WoW is that although it creates a meaningful long-term progression system, it lacks the immediacy and frequency of engagement that is often associated with a more accessible experience, something that modern WoW is much more focused on solving. So, bringing it all together, hopefully you can see how Classic WoW is able to build out a uniquely powerful sense of world, especially compared to its modern counterpart. Through the use of its sense of scale that helps the players feel like they are a small part of a large world, its sense of community that creates a consistent social ecosystem with social engagement opportunities over time, and its slower pace that reinforces to players through gameplay the importance of the 3D space they play in, it's able to utilize multiple game elements in service of the larger game design goal, creating the sense of world in World of Warcraft. Hey guys, thanks for watching. That was my second video, bit of a different topic than the first, but one that's very close to my heart. Obviously, as I said, I've been playing Classic, enjoying that a lot, grew up playing WoW, so it's been a trip. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you have any thoughts, feel free to leave a comment, let me know. Thanks again.